At the opening of the 1930s, Spain found itself immersed in a period of rapid and profoundly divisive change. The proclamation of the Second Republic in 1931 ignited widespread expectations of progress and renewal, yet it also released social tensions that had been simmering for generations. As the years leading up to 1936 unfolded, the country underwent mounting political polarization, expressed through mass strikes, attacks, street violence, and a growing radicalization that fractured society into mutually hostile camps. The Republic sought to transform the foundations of the state, but each attempt at reform was interpreted by one group as a perilous assault and by another as inadequate, deepening an atmosphere of continual tension. The early initiatives of Manuel Azaña's government, including military reform, the secularization of public life, agrarian restructuring, and the granting of regional autonomy, provoked fierce resistance among conservative sectors, from large landowners to ecclesiastical authorities and senior military figures. At the same time, broad segments of the working class felt that these reforms progressed too slowly, especially in the countryside, where land ownership remained starkly unequal. With every new measure, this double pressure widened the divide. Landowners feared an imminent social upheaval, rural day laborers demanded genuine land redistribution, and urban workers pressed for rapid gains in wages and working conditions. In 1932, one of the earliest indications of military dissent surfaced with the failed coup led by General José Sanjurjo, later known as the Sanjurjada. Though unsuccessful, it demonstrated that elements within the armed forces were willing to resort to force to derail the Republican project. This abortive uprising was followed by the expansion of clandestine conspiracies in key garrisons, while labor unions simultaneously encouraged increasingly militant strikes. Spain became a strategic board on which every action prompted an immediate reaction, leaving little room for moderation or compromise. By 1933, the crisis reached a decisive turning point. The November elections delivered victory to the right, coalesced around José María Gil Robles Cida, which supported a government headed by Alejandro Lerix. The new conservative majority sought to suspend, and in some cases reverse, reforms introduced by the Republican and Socialist coalition. The left interpreted this outcome as a betrayal of the Republic's founding ideals, while the right viewed it as a necessary corrective to what it perceived as revolutionary excess. Public spaces became symbolic battlegrounds. Large demonstrations, protest marches, and counter-rallies frequently degenerated into violent clashes, injuries, and occasional fatalities. In October 1934, an uprising erupted that cemented the widespread belief that Spain was entering a phase of intensifying violence. The inclusion of the Cida in government triggered the so-called Asturian Revolution, a revolt spearheaded by socialists, communists, and anarchists. The rebellion was crushed by the army under the command of General Franco, resulting in thousands of deaths and a brutal repression that left lasting political wounds. In Catalonia, President Luis Companys proclaimed a Catalan state within a Spanish federal republic, a symbolic gesture swiftly suppressed by central authorities. For many observers, the conclusion was clear: neither the right nor the left was prepared to accept certain outcomes imposed by the other through democratic procedures. In the aftermath of the insurrection, the right-wing government implemented repressive measures and policy reversals that further inflamed working-class anger. Numerous union leaders were jailed, and mass arrests swept through many localities. At the same time, extreme right groups such as the Falange escalated their attacks against left-wing activists. Labor organizations responded with boycotts, strikes, and targeted reprisals, fostering an environment of routine political violence. The streets of Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, Zaragoza, and Seville increasingly witnessed shootings and assaults. In 1935, corruption scandals severely weakened the Lerix government, opening the way for new elections. Those held in February 1936 would prove pivotal for Spain's future. Throughout the campaign, tensions rose to unprecedented heights. Inflammatory rhetoric, mass rallies guarded by hundreds of armed supporters, mutual threats, and a climate in which each side viewed the other not as a legitimate rival but as an existential enemy came to dominate public life. A fiercely partisan press further inflamed passions. Right-wing newspapers warned of Spain's Bolshevization, while left-wing outlets denounced the fascist danger embodied by the Cida and the Falange. The results gave victory to the Popular Front, a left-wing alliance of Republicans, Socialists, Communists, and allied groups. The new government released those imprisoned after the 1934 revolt and revived the reform agenda. Rather than easing tensions, however, polarization intensified further. Across the Spanish countryside, unemployed peasants launched waves of land occupations. In urban centers, clashes between Falangists and leftist militants became almost routine. In certain rural areas, de facto authorities emerged that disregarded official institutions, while elsewhere civil guards and right-wing militants responded with force. Between February and July 1936, Spain slid into a cycle of political assassinations. Historical estimates suggest that more than 200 people were killed in incidents linked to partisan violence during these months. Among the most consequential were the assassination of Assault Guard Lieutenant José Castillo, a socialist sympathizer, followed by the kidnapping and murder of monarchist leader José Calvo Sotelo. This latter act proved decisive. Segments of the military concluded that the government had lost control and that violence had become an accepted political tool. Many officers who had previously hesitated now moved closer to the conspiracy that had been developing for months. Meanwhile, generals such as Mola, Franco, Goad, and Queipo Delano secretly coordinated a military uprising intended to restore what they described as order and to halt both labor unrest and the advance of the left. The Republic struggled to maintain institutional authority amid rising social pressure. Civil governors warned of their inability to contain the violence, while unions denounced police repression and the actions of fascist organizations. In this context, any incident threatened to ignite the final spark, and the military conspiracy advanced, convinced that the situation was unsustainable. By mid-July 1936, tensions had reached their peak. The final weeks were marked by general strikes in several provinces, attempted attacks on local officials, and armed confrontations between left and right-wing groups. The Falange intensified its underground activities after being outlawed, while labor unions continued to arm themselves in anticipation of an inevitable showdown. The prevailing sense was that the Republic stood on the verge of collapse and that the nation was moving toward a violent reckoning. Amid this climate of fear, hostility, and mistrust, the military conspirators fixed the date for their uprising. At dawn on July 17 in Melilla, the first action of the coup designed to reshape Spain's destiny took place. What was intended as a swift and decisive operation would instead evolve into a far longer and more destructive conflict. The military uprising that began on July 17, 1936 did not emerge spontaneously, but rather from a conspiracy that had been maturing for months, even years, within the most conservative sectors of the armed forces. Following the Popular Front's victory in February, several senior officers intensified their coordination, perceiving a level of institutional breakdown that they believed threatened the nation's unity. On ships, in barracks, and within consulates, officers exchanged coded messages, verbal commitments, and plans ranging from the replacement of the government to the establishment of an authoritarian regime. The Spanish Military Union, a clandestine association of conservative officers, served as an operational center, weaving a network that linked garrisons in Navarre, Africa, Galicia, Seville, and Zaragoza. General Emilio Mola, based in Pamplona, emerged as the chief organizer of the plot. Operating under the codename The Director, he drafted a plan calling for a simultaneous uprising across the country, relying on speed and surprise to prevent an effective government response. His strategy envisioned a brief, precise coup capable of neutralizing loyal Republican forces within hours. In his secret instructions, Mola stressed the need for immediate and uncompromising repression once the movement commenced. Convinced that only terror could impose a new order, this element of brutality would later prove decisive in shaping the course of the conflict. Francisco Franco, then military commander in the Canary Islands, initially hesitated to join the plot. Although he shared Mola's assessment of the gravity of the situation, he feared the operation would fail without sufficient backing. However, the assassination of Calvo Sotelo and the escalation of street violence persuaded him that the Republic had reached a point of no return. To avoid suspicion, he feigned institutional loyalty while transmitting coded messages to the conspirators. His role would become crucial due to his control of the Army of Africa, the most disciplined and battle-hardened force in Spain. In Morocco, the Legion and the regulars stood ready to act swiftly. There, Colonel Juan Yeg, among the most radical officers in the army, would play a pivotal role in the coup's early stages. The close ties between the Africanist officers and Franco allowed orders to circulate with remarkable precision. On the peninsula, another indispensable figure was General José Sanjurjo, living in exile in Portugal since 1934. The conspirators viewed him as the ideal political and military leader to head the new regime, although he would never assume that position. The pre-uprising atmosphere was marked by profound uncertainty. The Republican government, led by Santiago Casares Quiroga, received contradictory intelligence about suspicious movements in several barracks. While some ministers demanded decisive action, Casares Quiroga hesitated, fearing that preventive measures would hasten the very outcome he sought to avert. The executive was aware that segments of the army sympathized with the right, but it underestimated the true scale of the conspiracy. The assault guard and the civil guard were divided, and many civil governors lacked the authority or resources to control the situation. On July 12, the assassination of Calvo Sotelo alarmed the conspirators. For them, the crime confirmed the collapse of public order and justified an immediate coup. Mola issued final instructions ordering the rebellious garrisons to be ready within 5 days, accelerating preparations. In Pamplona, Carlist recruits mobilized in support of the uprising. In Seville, contacts with right-wing civilians were finalized. In Zaragoza, General Cabanellas readied his troops. In Galicia, conservative-aligned commanders awaited the precise moment to act. On the morning of July 17 in Melilla, a group of Africanist officers decided to move several hours ahead of the original timetable. They feared that growing rumors would provoke a government response that might jeopardize the coup's success. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the Mala regiment revolted, detained Republican authorities, and declared a state of war. Within hours, Ceuta and Tetuan joined the uprising. Radio stations in Morocco broadcast the news, and the rebellion spread quickly throughout the protectorate. The government, surprised by the speed of events, tried to react, but information arrived in fragments. That same night, Franco made a decision he had been avoiding for weeks. From the Canary Islands, he sent a telegram announcing his adherence to the coup and traveled to the Cape Ubi archipelago to assume command of the Army of Africa. On July 18, he broadcast a manifesto justifying the uprising as a patriotic act meant to save Spain from chaos. His words sought to create the impression of an orderly and unified movement, although in reality, the uprising was unfolding unevenly. In the peninsula, the garrisons reacted with mixed results. In Navarre, the coup triumphed immediately thanks to massive Carist support. The same occurred in Galicia, Burgos, Salamanca, and part of Andalusia, where Capodino seized Seville through a combination of cunning, intimidation, and brutal initial repression. In Castile and Leon, the rebels managed to control almost all major cities, consolidating a key territorial bloc for the war's later development. However, in Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, and Bilbao, the reaction was different. The resistance of forces loyal to the Republic and labor mobilization thwarted the rebels' plans. In Madrid, the Director General of Security ordered the distribution of weapons to labor organizations once it became clear that several garrisons were rising up. Socialist, communist, and anarchist militias quickly seized factories, barracks, and strategic buildings. Rebel troops were neutralized in most critical points, allowing the capital to remain in Republican hands. In Barcelona, the CNT and the FA played a decisive role. After hours of street fighting, anarchist militias stormed the rebellious barracks and defeated the insurgent forces, securing control of the city. In other regions, the situation was more confusing. In Aragon and Extremadura, some garrisons hesitated until the last moment. In Valencia, the uprising failed thanks to the combined action of the Assault Guard and the unions in Malaga, Granada, and Córdoba. Control was disputed street by street with differing results depending on the city. The final outcome of these initial days was a country split in two, with a fracture line not necessarily corresponding to historical divisions but rather to each side's speed of reaction and the loyalty of military units. Meanwhile, in the Moroccan Protectorate, the Army of Africa reorganized under Franco's command. The Legion and the Regulares had a decisive advantage: discipline, mobility, and firepower superior to most peninsula units. Their transfer to the peninsula, however, was a challenge. The Republican government controlled most of the fleet, making it difficult to cross the strait. It was in this context that Germany and Italy began to intervene decisively, providing planes to transport Franco's troops and ensuring that the Army of Africa could quickly join the war. The uprising, intended to be swift and forceful, turned into a prolonged confrontation. The partial failure of the coup created an unexpected scenario for the conspirators. Instead of taking power in a matter of hours, they found themselves trapped in a war of positions. The Republican government, weakened but still functional, tried to reorganize its forces while the rebel military consolidated key territories. In various towns, civilians joined the fight en masse, forming militias and turning cities into improvised battlefields. The country thus entered an open conflict whose early battles would mark a before and after, and it would be precisely this initial division, with its improvised defenses, disorganized militias, and hurried military maneuvers, that would give way to the full outbreak of armed confrontation, the division of the country and the outbreak of the conflict. When the coup stopped being a military maneuver and became an open confrontation, Spain found itself divided into two territories that did not respond solely to geographic logic, but to the speed, forcefulness, and loyalty with which different garrisons reacted during the first days. On July 18 and 19, 1936, while some cities fell under rebel control with almost no resistance, others improvised defenses to halt the military advance and maintain republican legality. This initial fragmentation determined the structure of the conflict. The Republic kept most major urban and industrial centers, while the rebels took control of wide rural areas in the interior and the north, as well as strategic corridors for future military operations. The resulting map was not static but dynamic and changing. In the north, the nationalists secured Navarra, Castilla, Leon, and Galicia, creating a continuous strip that allowed them to coordinate operations through conservative territories with well-armed traditionalist groups such as the Carist Requates. In contrast, the Republic maintained control of Madrid, Barcelona, Bilbao, Valencia, and most of the Mediterranean coast, which guaranteed access to the sea, vital industries, and a mobilized urban base. And was split. Sevilla, Cádiz, and Córdoba fell on the nationalist side, while Malaga and Cayenne remained Republican. Aragon was divided irregularly, and Extremadura became a contested corridor key to connecting or isolating entire regions. In many towns and cities, the reaction did not depend solely on military presence, but on the local political balance. In places where left-wing unions and parties were strongly established, the population mobilized quickly, erecting barricades, attacking rebel barracks, and arming themselves with anything available. Seized weapons, agricultural tools, and even dynamite from nearby mines. In cities like Madrid and Barcelona, popular pressure was decisive. The working masses prevented rebel forces from taking key positions, halting their initial offensive. In contrast, in Burgos, Salamanca, or Valladolid, the widespread sympathy for the right allowed the rebels to consolidate control with hardly any popular resistance. The Republic, surprised by the scope of the uprising, had to reorganize its forces urgently. The government, aware that a large part of the army had joined the coup or was internally divided, authorized the distribution of weapons to workers' organizations. Thus emerged the first militias, improvised columns of anarchists, socialists, communists, and republicans marching toward the most vulnerable fronts. Their enthusiasm partially compensated for their lack of military discipline, but this spontaneity also created problems of coordination, logistics, and command, which would become evident in the following weeks. Meanwhile, the rebels consolidated a unified command from Burgos, which quickly became the de facto capital of the nationalist side. General Mlur directed operations in the north. In Sevilla, Capo Diolano used a combination of radio, propaganda, terror, and military actions to expand his control through western Andalusia. Franco, after crossing the strait thanks to the airlift facilitated by Germany and Italy, set out to link the protectorate with the peninsula, which would make the Army of Africa a decisive force for the nationalists' next advances. The clash between these two dynamics, improvised militias on one side and professional troops on the other, shaped the first fronts of the war. The rebels' immediate objective was to advance toward Madrid, convinced that the fall of the capital would bring down the Republic. To do so, they needed to cross regions still in dispute: Extremadura, Castilla, Lancia, and part of Andalusia. The Republic in turn sought to reorganize its defenses and regain control of areas where the uprising had succeeded. The result was a series of advances and setbacks that within weeks turned the country into a vast and shifting battlefield. In Extremadura, Republican columns from Madrid and Valencia attempted to stop the advance of the African troops. The militias, however, lacked heavy weapons and military discipline, which made them vulnerable to the regular and legionnaires trained for fast and forceful combat. Verafranca de los Barros, Mérida, and Badajoz became scenes of confrontations that revealed the brutality of the conflict. The capture of Bat in August 1936, commanded by Yag, resulted in one of the war's most remembered massacres and secured a strategic connection between the north and south of rebel territory. In the North, the Basque Country and Aureas remained loyal to the Republic but isolated from the Central Zone. 2. Retain control, they organized defense councils and mobilized both workers' militias and disciplined battalions. Aware of their precarious situation, Basque industry, especially its arms factories, became crucial for sustaining the Republican war effort. In Aureas, miners experienced in the use of explosives since the 1934 uprising played a key role in defending access to the region. In Catalonia, the popular victory over the rebel military opened space for a social revolution that transformed both urban and rural life. Factories, transportation, and land were collectivized by anarchists and socialists, creating an atmosphere of revolutionary euphoria that coexisted with military urgency. Catalan militia columns marched toward Aragon, intending to retake Zaragoza, one of the rebels' strongest strongholds. However, the lack of coordination between various political and military factions hindered these operations, which progressed slowly and with significant logistical difficulties. The Republican government underwent a process of accelerated transformation. The resignation of Casares Quiroa on July 19, followed by that of Martínez Barrio, whose attempt to negotiate with the rebels failed within hours, culminated in the rise of José Hall, who made the critical decision to arm the people. Without that measure, the Republic would likely have been defeated within days. But the proliferation of autonomous militias also temporarily disrupted military command, creating a mosaic of forces with diverse loyalties and little centralized coordination. Meanwhile, the rebels moved toward creating a unified command structure. The death of Sancho on July 20, when the small plane that was to bring him from Portugal crashed shortly after takeoff, left a political leadership vacuum. Mler continued directing military operations, but Franco's growing prominence along with his control of the Army of Africa and his early success in Sila positioned him as an increasingly influential figure. This process would culminate months later when the nationalists proclaimed him head of state and generalissimo, consolidating a single command that would have decisive consequences for the war. In Madrid, the situation was chaotic. Thousands of volunteers arrived at barracks asking for weapons. Unions formed committees to control neighborhoods, stations, and factories. And the government tried to maintain a functional state structure while reorganizing an almost dismantled army. The first weeks were marked by constant rumors of imminent attacks, raids against alleged conspirators, disappearances, and extrajudicial executions carried out by uncontrolled groups, especially in the most turbulent days of the summer. The nationalists, aware of the symbolic and strategic importance of the capital, focused their efforts on advancing from the south. After taking Badaj, the Army of Africa continued toward Madrid, rapidly occupying towns and cities and applying immediate repression in every locality. This advance spread terror among the Republican population and produced a massive flow of refugees toward the major cities. Roads filled with families fleeing with only the essentials, while militias tried to improvise defenses in poorly equipped towns. In the Republican zone, the initial enthusiasm did not prevent the first signs of internal fragmentation. Anarchists, communists, socialists, and Republicans had different views on how to organize defense, distribute weapons, and structure the rear guard. This lack of unity would become evident in later episodes, but even in these early weeks, it was already hindering military coordination. Even so, working-class mobilization prevented the nationalists from taking Madrid in a quick strike, forcing a prolonged war. The country was thus divided into two zones with political, economic, and military systems that began diverging sharply. In the nationalist zone, military juntas and a centralized command combining conservative tradition, Catholicism, and strict discipline were established. In the Republican zone, a complex mix emerged. A weakened state, popular militias, and revolutionary experiments, especially in Catalonia and Aragon. This divergence would shape the evolution of the war and create internal tensions with decisive consequences. International intervention. The Spanish Civil War from its earliest weeks ceased to be a purely internal conflict and became a stage where European powers projected their ideologies, strategic interests, and fears about the political future of the
continent.
What had begun in July 1936 as a military uprising against a legitimate government immediately turned into a war laboratory where dictatorships and democracies tested their strength, tried out weapons, and measured the resistance of potential adversaries.
European ideological
polarization made Spain a testing ground for the tensions that would lead to the Second World War.
The intervention of
Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy was decisive from the outset.
Adolf Hitler,
informed of the uprising through nationalist envoys and diplomatic contacts, saw in the Spanish conflict an
exceptional strategic opportunity. Spain could become a key geographic ally, controlling the western access to the Mediterranean and providing a base to influence France. Moreover, the Führer viewed Spain as an ideal setting to test new aerial warfare tactics and refine weaponry that would later be used in Europe. Within days, Germany organized the dispatch of the first contingent of June's Ju-52 transport aircraft to facilitate the airlift between Morocco and the peninsula, enabling the transfer of the Army of Africa, the backbone of Franco's forces. Shortly afterward, the first combat aircraft of the future Condor Legion arrived, an expeditionary force composed of pilots, technicians, and German anti-aircraft units. Although their presence was initially limited, their impact would be enormous. The Condor Legion not only provided air superiority for the nationalists, but also introduced tactics that would change modern warfare: dive bombing, targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure, and trials of mixed squadron formations. For Hitler, Spain became a military school where the Luftwaffe could experiment without the diplomatic constraints a direct conflict with a major European power would entail. Mussolini's Italy, for its part, intervened with equal determination, but with its own objectives. The Duce saw the Spanish conflict as an opportunity to expand his influence in the Western Mediterranean and demonstrate Italian supremacy within European fascism. Within weeks, Italy sent aircraft, light artillery, armored vehicles, and thousands of soldiers. The Corpo Truppe Volontarie, officially formed by volunteers but largely composed of regular military personnel, took part in major operations from 1937 onward and exceeded 70,000 troops throughout the conflict. Their presence was notable on key fronts such as Guadalajara and Malaga. Although their military performance did not always match fascist ambition, German-Italian intervention was not limited to military aid. Both regimes sent advisors to reorganize the nationalist command structure, establish repressive practices, and coordinate propaganda. Foreign support allowed Franco to consolidate an image of strong leadership, paving the way for his later appointment as Generalissimo and head of state. The steady supply of weapons, fuel, ammunition, and specialized technicians ensured that the nationalists maintained an accumulating advantage that would prove decisive as the war continued. Meanwhile, the Republic desperately sought help, aware that it could not face two fascist powers providing unlimited assistance to the rebels. However, it encountered an unfavorable diplomatic landscape. France, under the Popular Front government led by Léon Blum, sympathized ideologically with the Republican cause and initially considered sending weapons. But internal pressures and fear of triggering a wider European conflict led Paris to back down. The United Kingdom, guided by a policy of non-intervention intended to prevent a domino effect in Europe, strongly opposed any aid to the Republic and pressured France not to intervene. This stance, presented as neutrality, effectively favored the nationalist side. In August 1936, the Non-Intervention Committee was created, under British initiative supposedly to prevent foreign powers from sending weapons to either side. More than 20 countries signed the agreement. But while Germany and Italy openly ignored the ban and continued sending arms, the committee became an obstacle for the Republic. Every attempt to acquire aircraft, tanks, or rifles was blocked, delayed, or confiscated in foreign ports. The international imbalance was evident. The nationalists received direct, sustained, and well-organized support, while the Republic had to resort to clandestine channels, fragmented purchases, and complex diplomatic maneuvers. Faced with this blockade, the Soviet Union became the main ally of the Republican government. Stalin, though initially reluctant, decided to intervene when he realized that Franco's victory would strengthen Hitler and Mussolini. He also saw Spain as an ideal terrain to expand Soviet influence and test modern weaponry. In October 1936, the first shipments of T-26 tanks, Polikarpov aircraft, and Soviet military advisors arrived. These specialists played a crucial role in reorganizing the Republican Army, turning scattered militias into more disciplined and coordinated units. Although Soviet aid never matched the scale of Nazi-fascist support, it enabled the Republic to resist for years, especially in its most critical moments. Soviet intervention was accompanied by the arrival of the International Brigades, a unique phenomenon in contemporary history.
From Paris, the Commune promoted the formation of volunteer units from dozens of countries: France, Germany, Italy, the United States, the United Kingdom, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and even Latin America. Thousands of men and women motivated by anti-fascism, revolutionary idealism, or the desire to halt Hitler's advance in Europe traveled clandestinely across the Pyrenees to join the fight. The first brigades formed in the autumn of 1936 played a fundamental role in the defense of Madrid and became an international symbol of resistance. However, Soviet aid was not free of internal tensions. The Communist Party of Spain, strengthened by its relationship with Moscow, adopted a strategy of military centralization and strict discipline that clashed with anarchists and socialists of more decentralized leanings. The USSR also used its influence to shape internal Republican politics according to its interests, provoking tensions that would erupt violently during the events of May 1937.
In Barcelona,
this political dimension of foreign aid had profound effects on the course of the war. Meanwhile, other countries maintained ambiguous positions.
Portugal under Salazar's dictatorship collaborated covertly with the nationalists, allowing the transit of weapons and volunteers and sending a few thousand Varados combatants who formerly acted as volunteers but in practice received state support. Mexico, on the other hand, became one of the few countries that openly supported the Republic, sending weapons supplies and receiving thousands of exiles. Its assistance, though limited compared to the Soviet contribution, had important symbolic value and helped sustain a government increasingly isolated. The war thus became an internationalized conflict in which the major powers of the 20th century participated directly or indirectly. The nationalists received constant, coordinated, and massive support from Germany and Italy. The Republic depended on the USSR and the international brigades, while Western democracies maintained a neutrality that in practice further unbalanced the conflict.
This inequality in resources, advisors, and logistics would soon become evident in the major military operations beginning around Madrid, which would define the pace of the war. As the conflict progressed, foreign presence ceased to be an external element and became an integral part of both sides' strategies. Spain's skies filled with German, Italian, and Soviet aircraft. The fronts were populated with tanks and artillery whose models anticipated those of the future World War. Cities endured massive bombings designed to break civilian morale. The Spanish Civil War thus became the direct prelude to the global confrontation that would erupt in 1939, the Battle for Madrid, when the columns of the Army of Africa advanced toward the capital in mid-October 1936. Madrid became the absolute symbol of Republican resistance and the most ambitious strategic objective of the rebels. The city, with more than 1 million inhabitants, was the political, administrative, and emotional center of the Republic. Its fall would likely have caused the immediate collapse of the government and possibly a swift victory for the coup. But what Franco expected to be a decisive and brief operation turned into one of the longest, bloodiest, and most significant urban battles of the 20th century. The nationalist advance toward Madrid began after the fall of Toledo, where the relief of the Alcázar provided Franco with a propaganda triumph of enormous impact. From that moment on, the general Isimo concentrated his efforts on taking the capital. The route opened from the southwest, and the legionary and regular troops advanced with discipline that contrasted with the improvised resistance of Republican militias. In
towns like Navalcarro, Mosils and Tala, the legionaries implemented a policy of terror intended to see out fear
and break any resistance before the siege of Madrid. In the capital, the situation was chaotic, but the popular
spirit had not weakened.
Aware of its vulnerability, the government decided to transfer to Valencia on November 6, a
controversial move that left the Madrid Defense Council as the main authority in the city. Led by General José Milla, the
council coordinated defense efforts together with the newly created 5th Regiment, a model unit organized by the
communists that imposed military discipline in an environment where militias still operated with informal structures.
The slogan "They shall not pass," pronounced by Dolores Ibárruri La Pasionaria, became a unifying cry and a symbol of the will to resist. The arrival of the international brigades
marked a turning point in the defense. In mid-November, the 12th and 11th Brigades, composed of French, German,
Polish, Italian, and Balkan volunteers, entered Madrid, marching down Gran Via amid applause, flags, tears, and cheers. For many inhabitants, seeing thousands of foreigners willing to fight and die for the Republican cause was an enormous
moral boost.
Although their military experience varied, their discipline and cohesion brought a much-needed sense of
professionalization to the city. The first major nationalist attack focused on the Casado and the Manzanares River,
seeking to break through toward the heart of the city. For days, legionaries and regular troops
launched intense assaults on Republican lines. The battles at the Puente de los Franceses became one of the most iconic
episodes of the early siege, frontal attacks under crossfire, positions changing hands several times a day, and
continuous bombings that turned buildings and parks into piles of rubble. The international brigades, along with 5th Regiment units, managed to halt the attackers at the cost of many casualties. Unable to break the western front, Franco redirected the attack toward the University City, an area then
under urban development with many buildings under construction that were transformed into defensive positions.
From late November onward, the battle took on an intensely urban character. Faculties, hospitals, residence halls, and university corridors became improvised trenches. Combatants fought
classroom by classroom, staircase by staircase, using desks as barricades and underground passageways as communication
routes. The Casada Velázquez, the Clínico, and the Faculty of Medicine witnessed
particularly fierce fighting where gains were measured in mere meters. The nationalists expected the material and tactical superiority of the Army of Africa to be decisive in an urban environment, but reality proved
different. Narrow streets, ruined buildings, and Republican determination cancelled out their initial advantage.
The African columns found themselves exposed to sniper fire, surprise counterattacks, and ambushes in which
militias familiar with the terrain made use of every corner. The war of attrition favored the Republic, which received new reinforcements and was better positioned to defend inside the city than to launch external offensives. Propaganda played a central role during those days.
Capo Dino broadcast daily radio speeches from Sevilla, predicting the imminent fall of Madrid and issuing threats against the population. In response, Republican radio exalted the
resistance and celebrated every counterattack, no matter how small. This psychological war sought to break the opponent's morale, but in Madrid, it had the opposite effect.
The city resisted with an almost ritual sense of defiance, becoming a symbol of international anti-fascism.
July 1936 had shown that the Republic was capable of mobilizing the masses to stop a coup.
November of that same year revealed that it could also withstand an
organized military offensive. The Madrid Defense Council improved coordination and began gradually integrating the
militias into a popular army, while the communists pushed to establish strict military discipline across all fronts.
This reorganization, although still incomplete, helped stabilize defenses.
Franco, facing the failure of a direct assault, decided to encircle the city gradually.
Between December 1936 and January 1937, the nationalists launched offensives toward the La Coruña Road and the Jarama River, aiming to cut Madrid's connections with the rest of Republican territory. The attack along the
La Coruña Road was halted after fierce fighting in El Pardo and Majadahonda, where Republican lines held at great
cost.
The Battle of Jarama, which broke out in February 1937, was even bloodier.
For weeks, the nationalists attempted to cut the Valencia Road, the Republic's main supply route. The intervention of The international brigades, particularly the 15th Brigade, stopped the advance, though at an extremely high human cost. At the same time, another nationalist operation, this time supported by the Italian Corpo Tube Voluntari, failed in Guadalajara in March 1937. The Italian defeat had not only military repercussions but also significant propaganda effects. It showed that fascist forces were not invincible and boosted Republican morale. However, these defensive victories did not change the strategic reality. Madrid remained under siege, isolated from the Republican north and subjected to constant bombardment. Daily life for Madrid's inhabitants during the winter of 1936 to 1937 was an exercise in survival. Air raid shelters were improvised in basement, metro stations, and railway tunnels. Food was scarce and strict rations were imposed. While fighting continued in the university city, residents carried on with their routines as much as possible. Children attended improvised schools, the sick were transported under artillery fire, and entire families moved through the city amid ruins, smoke, and constant alarms. Madrid's resistance, sustained by the sacrifice of thousands of civilians, became one of the most admired elements of the Republican war effort. Franco, unable to break the defense, but determined to maintain pressure, opted for a prolonged siege. His strategy relied on gradually isolating the city and wearing down its defenders, confident that nationalist material superiority would eventually prevail. The Republic in turn transformed the defense of Madrid into a political and moral symbol, aware that its fall would have devastating effects both on the war and on the international perception of the conflict. The major military campaigns. After the resistance of Madrid in November 1936, the war entered a phase of large-scale military campaigns that would define the evolution of the conflict. Both sides understood that the capital, although symbolically central, would not fall through a quick frontal assault. For this reason, the objective became the gradual destruction of the enemy's military capacity in open fronts where mobility, heavy weaponry, and logistics would be determining factors. Between 1937 and 1938, some of the bloodiest and most extensive battles of the war took place: Jarama, Guadalajara, Brunit, Teruel, and the decisive Battle of the Ebro. These battles revealed the growing professionalization of the Republican Popular Army, but also the accumulation of resources, discipline, and air superiority of the nationalist side. The Battle of Jarama in February 1937 was the first major nationalist offensive to cut the Madrid-Valencia road, the main supply route to the capital. After the failure in the Casado and the university city, Franco sought to surround Madrid from the southeast. Nationalist troops advanced with initial speed, occupying elevated positions and directly threatening communication between Madrid and the rest of the Republican zone. However, resistance was fierce. The international brigades, especially the 15th Brigade with the American Lincoln Battalion and British, Irish and Balkan volunteers, played a key role in stopping the offensive. The Jarama Valley became a landscape of contested hills, burned olive groves, and riverbanks shattered by explosions. Hand-to-hand fighting, successive charges, and night counterattacks left thousands dead. Although the nationalists conquered part of the terrain, they failed to cut the road and the front stabilized. Just a month later, the Battle of Guadalajara began, an operation in which the main role was played by the Italian Corpo Troop Volontaria. Mussolini wanted a decisive and symbolic victory. Convinced that his troops, superior in numbers and motorized equipment, would quickly defeat the Republican forces, the advance began under cold and humid weather that soon became a decisive factor. The Italians progressed, initially taking towns and secondary routes, but rain, mud, and fog severely affected their movements. When the Popular Army counterattacked, supported by Soviet T-26 tanks and well-coordinated units, the Italians were forced to retreat. The mechanized columns were trapped on muddy roads turned into easy targets for Republican artillery. The defeat at Guadalajara was a strategic and propaganda blow for the nationalists. For the first time, a fascist offensive was clearly defeated in open field. It also strengthened the Popular Army's confidence in its ability to resist and reorganize. The next major Republican operation took place in Brunette in July 1937. After months on the defensive, the
Republic decided to take the initiative with an offensive intended to relieve pressure on Madrid by forcing the
Nationalists to withdraw troops from the north. The operation began with a rapid advance. Republican forces took Brunette
and several nearby towns, surprising the nationalist positions.
Tanks, anti-tank
guns, and Republican aviation were deployed in coordination with Popular Army units more disciplined than in
earlier phases of the war. However, the nationalist counterattack was devastating.
The Condor Legion, better equipped and with air superiority, systematically bombed Republican positions, while infantry and artillery
units retook ground.
The extreme summer heat with temperatures above 40 degrees caused
massive dehydration, logistical failures, and exhaustion. Although the Republic demonstrated offensive
capability, Brunette resulted in tremendous attrition that weakened some of its most valuable units without
achieving a lasting strategic shift. At the end of 1937, one of the hardest and
most symbolic campaigns of the war would unfold, the Battle of Teruel.
The city, located in a strategic area between
Aragon and the plateau, was in nationalist hands and represented a potential link point for attacking
Valencia.
The Republican government, pressured by the fall of the north where Bilbao had capitulated in June and
Santander in August, needed a significant victory.
Teruel seemed the right target, isolated with a limited garrison and in a region difficult for reinforcements to reach.
The attack began in December 1937 in the middle of
winter. Republican troops advanced through blizzards, ice, and temperatures that reached 20 degrees below zero.
After
fierce fighting, they managed to penetrate the city and surround the nationalist garrison.
General Ray Dar
resisted in several fortified buildings, but finally surrendered on the 8th of January, 1938.
The first provincial capital captured by the Republic during the entire war.
However, the joy was short-lived.
Franco launched a massive counteroffensive a few days later.
Nationalist troops arrived with reinforcements, heavy artillery, and
continuous air support. The presence of the Condor Legion was decisive. Constant bombings turned Teruel into a sea of ruins, making any orderly defense impossible. Republican troops, exhausted, frozen, and short on supplies, slowly withdrew until the city fell again under nationalist control in mid-February. The fall of Teruel had dramatic effects.
Republican forces had suffered enormous losses in men, weaponry, and morale, and their ability to launch counter-offensives was seriously
damaged.
Franco, taking advantage of this, launched the Aragon offensive in March
1938. This operation split Republican territory in two.
The nationalists advanced from Zaragoza toward the
Mediterranean, taking Larida Frager and eventually reaching Vineros. The Republic was divided into two disconnected zones, the Central Zone and the Catalan Zone, representing a major strategic blow.
In this critical context, the Republican government sought to launch one last major offensive that could change the course
of the war.
This operation would be the Battle of the Ebro, launched in July 1938.
The objective was to force the nationalists to divert troops eastward, relieve pressure on Valencia, and if possible, regain territory in Catalonia.
Thousands of soldiers of the Popular Army crossed the Ebro River in a
carefully planned night operation.
Improvised pontoon bridges, silent boats, and campaign bridges allowed
Republican units to enter enemy territory before nationalist aviation could detect them.
The first hours were a success. Republican troops advanced and occupied several elevated positions,
taking the nationalists by surprise. However, Franco's reaction was immediate and brutal. Determined to prevent any
significant advance, he ordered the concentration of artillery, aviation, and entire divisions to launch a direct
counterattack.
The Condor Legion bombed the Republican bridges while Italian aviation attacked the newly captured positions. Fighting in the Pandals and Cables mountain ranges was extremely intense.
Trenches in ravines, snipers hidden among agricultural terraces, entire columns of exhausted soldiers advancing under the scorching summer sun of Catalonia.
The Battle of the Ebro lasted more than 3 months, becoming the longest and bloodiest of the entire war. Day after day, the popular army resisted fiercely. But its resources were running out. Without air superiority or supplies comparable to those of the nationalists, Republican units began to slowly lose ground. Bridges over the Ebro were rebuilt again and again, only to be destroyed once more by German and Italian bombings. When the last Republican soldier crossed back to the left bank of the river in late November 1938, the outcome was irreversible. The Republic had lost its last great military gamble, Guernica, and the bombings against civilians. At the beginning of 1937, the Civil War had entered a phase in which aviation, until then secondary in European conflicts, began to gain unprecedented prominence. Both Germany and Italy used Spanish territory as a testing ground for aerial tactics that they would later apply in the Second World War. For the civilian population, this meant the emergence of a new type of violence, systematic bombings, dive attacks, and the destruction of entire cities from the air. Among all these episodes, the most emblematic and devastating would be the bombing of Guernica on April 26, 1937. Immediately transformed into a universal symbol of modern terror, the Basque region was strategic for the nationalists. After the fall of Madrid, as an immediate objective, Franco concentrated his efforts on the northern front. Bisque, Santander, and Aureus. Basque industry was vital for the Republican war effort. In addition, its geographical isolation made sending reinforcements difficult. In this context, Guernica, a small city of great symbolic importance to the Basque people, was located near the front line. It was not an essential military target, but its destruction sought to break Basque morale and facilitate the advance on Bilbao. The Condor Legion and the Italian Legionary Aviation had intensified their operations in the north since March. The German command saw in Spain an opportunity to practice new tactics, especially the combination of carpet attacks and bombings in successive waves. Guernica presented itself as an ideal setting, a small city with wooden buildings connected by strategic bridges and located in a corridor that the nationalists wished to control. The civilian population could not imagine the magnitude of the attack that was about to come. On Monday, April 26, Market Day, hundreds of people crowded the streets of Guernica coming from nearby towns. At 4:30 p.m., the first planes appeared in the sky. German Heinkel 111 and Dornier Do 7 bombers, escorted by Mesmet fighters. Their first action was to cut off the exits by bombing the access roads and highways. Immediately afterward came the second wave with incendiary and explosive bombs falling at regular intervals designed to destroy buildings and cause massive fires. For more than 3 hours, the city was attacked without interruption. The combination of explosive and phosphorus bombs created an urban inferno. The wooden houses burned easily, the streets filled with smoke, shrapnel, and rubble. Entire families were trapped under collapsed buildings. German fighters flying at low altitude strafed civilians fleeing into the open countryside, multiplying the panic. When the attack finally ended, Guernica was a smoking ruin. More than 70% of its buildings had been destroyed. The exact number of dead is still debated, but it is estimated that between 150 and 300 people lost their lives in a city that barely exceeded 6,000 inhabitants. The international impact was immediate. In London, Paris, and New York, newspapers published devastating images of the destruction. British journalist George Steer, present at the site shortly after the attack, wrote reports that revealed the truth about the bombing. Guernica had been deliberately attacked to terrorize the civilian population. His report, published in the Times and the New York Times, disproved the nationalist version, which tried to justify the destruction by attributing it to a supposed fire started by the Republicans themselves. That propaganda strategy failed. The evidence was too overwhelming. Guernica quickly became a universal symbol, consolidated soon after, when Pablo Picasso, shocked by the news, painted his most famous work. Although the canvas is not part of the military conflict itself, its symbolic power amplified the international denunciation of the bombing. For millions of people, the painting represented the suffering of Spanish civilians and turned the
Basque City into an icon of 20th-century anti-militarism. But Guernica was not an isolated case. From the early months of the war, bombings against civilians had become a recurring tactic. In November 1936, the Condor Legion bombed Durango, causing hundreds of deaths. In Madrid, aerial attacks intensified during the siege. Between November 1936 and March 1937, the capital endured the first systematic aerial bombardments of a European city. German and Italian aircraft dropped bombs on residential districts while Madrilenians sought refuge in metro shelters. For the first time in Europe, a major urban center experienced sustained bombing aimed at undermining civilian morale. In Barcelona, the situation was even more severe. In March 1938, Italian planes carried out a series of continuous bombings over several days, striking densely populated areas without clear military objectives. These attacks, regarded as among the first systematic acts of aerial terrorism in history, leveled entire city blocks and left more than 1,000 dead. The international community responded with indignation, yet no European power intervened to halt the air raids. The policy of non-intervention continued to favor the rebels, who enjoyed unparalleled air support. Republican forces, for their part, also conducted bombings, though on a much smaller scale and with extremely limited resources. Republican aviation lacked the technical capacity to execute sustained or large-scale operations. Nevertheless, Soviet-supplied Katyusha bombers carried out sorties over cities under rebel control, including Zaragoza and Seville. Yet the disparity in intensity, frequency, and civilian casualties was stark. While the nationalists and their allies regularly targeted urban centers, Republican strikes were sporadic, tactical, and comparatively constrained. The psychological impact of aerial terror became decisive. In all affected areas, civilians were forced to restructure daily life around sirens, shelters, and nightly blackouts. Underground bunkers in Madrid and Barcelona became spaces where entire families spent nights under the roar of aircraft. Cities began deploying rudimentary anti-aircraft defenses, rooftop batteries, barrage balloons, and smokescreens. However, none of these measures could counter the technological superiority of the Condor Legion or the legionary aviation. Aerial warfare also reshaped international perceptions of the conflict in Europe and America. Guernica and the bombings of Barcelona were viewed as warnings of what lay ahead. For diplomats and military observers, Spain became a disturbing mirror, foreshadowing the devastation, mass displacement, and indiscriminate bombings that would strike London, Warsaw, Rotterdam, and Dresden only a few years later. The Spanish Civil War revealed both human suffering and the emerging logic of total war. Everyday life during the conflict took on a parallel reality. While major military operations progressed along Spain's fronts, civilians navigated shortages, fear, and constant adaptation to a landscape that had abandoned all semblance of normality. The war was not merely a confrontation between armies, it was a profound social drama that transformed customs, labor, food distribution, and the structure of daily life. In both Republican and nationalist zones, ordinary people had to reorganize every facet of existence according to wartime imperatives. Internal dynamics in each zone produced different experiences. In Republican areas, particularly in major cities such as Madrid, Barcelona, and Valencia, the influx of refugees became one of the gravest social challenges. Families from towns devastated by fighting or threatened by nationalist offensives fled with whatever they could carry: blankets, utensils, photographs, clothing, overcrowding train stations in search of improvised accommodation in schools, convents, and requisitioned public buildings. The demographic surge intensified scarcity, accelerated rationing, and forced the government to allocate limited resources for humanitarian relief. Food supply emerged as a critical issue in Madrid. During the siege, queues outside shops were endless. Ration cards fixed strict allocations of bread, oil, rice, and legumes, yet supplies were often insufficient. Families improvised substitutions: thin soups from nearly bare bones, ersatz coffee, bread mixed with inferior flour. Occasional convoys from Valencia or Almeria brought provisions, but bombings and destroyed roads complicated logistics. Women, primarily responsible for procuring food, traveled across neighborhoods seeking black market vendors or alternative sources. In Barcelona, the experience was similar, albeit shaped by the social revolution led by anarchists and socialists. During early 1936, many shops were collectivized, and public dining halls provided meals daily at minimal or no cost. Revolutionary economic ideals coexisted with practical difficulties in food supply. Chronic shortages of meat, milk, and sugar were exacerbated by the Italian bombings of 1938. Continuous blackouts transformed the city into a landscape of shadows, where families dined by candlelight and prepared to flee to shelters at the sound of sirens. Rural life was also profoundly altered. In Republican areas, especially Catalonia and Aragon, lands were collectivized,
crops reorganized, and agricultural cooperatives formed to maintain production despite the mobilization of thousands of workers to the front. In some towns, the social revolution fostered enthusiasm and solidarity. In others, it created tensions between peasants supporting collectivization and those defending private property. The common challenge was sustaining production amid war and army requisitions. Life in nationalist zones was equally harsh but took different forms. Under Franco, strict discipline, traditional hierarchies, and Catholic morality shaped daily life. Cities such as Burgos, Salamanca, and Valladolid appeared more stable than Republican zones, yet stability existed alongside pervasive repression. Any suspected Republican sympathies could trigger arrests, summary trials, or executions, leaving entire families in fear of denunciation. The new Francoist municipalities purged officials, teachers, and workers deemed disloyal. Food shortages were also present, particularly in early months, but control over extensive agricultural regions and aid from Germany and Italy ensured access to wheat, livestock, and essential products. Nevertheless, rationing persisted, and in cities like Seville or Zaragoza, long lines formed for bread, oil, and potatoes. Many families bartered goods for food. Fear permeated everyday life. Nationalist air raids on Madrid and Republican bombings on Zaragoza produced constant anxiety. Public executions and forced disappearances created mandatory silence in nationalist areas, while uncontrolled detentions by militias in Republican zones spread uncertainty for anyone suspected of rebel sympathies. Civilians lived under permanent vigilance. Repression took many forms. War councils judged teachers, journalists, unionists, or peasants in the nationalist rear, while Republican improvised detention centers, overseen by militias or parties, interrogated and sometimes executed suspected conspirators. Although scale and organization differed, daily life was politicized, and every action could be construed as allegiance to one side or the other. Education underwent radical transformation. In Republican zones, many children attended classes in basements, shelters, or improvised courtyards. Teachers strove to preserve normality despite interruptions from sirens or evacuations. Cultural initiatives, including mobile libraries, war theaters, and public readings, helped maintain morale. In contrast, education in nationalist zones came under strict religious and military supervision, infused with Francoist propaganda and Catholic teachings promoting obedience, patriotism, and discipline. Public health suffered severely, hospitals were overcrowded, medicines scarce, and outbreaks of typhus and tuberculosis widespread in both zones. Women played key roles as nurses, organizers of dining halls, and caregivers for refugees. Children, particularly vulnerable, endured malnutrition, respiratory illnesses, and psychological trauma from constant bombing. Humanitarian organizations, the Red Cross, and foreign medical personnel offered assistance, but the scale of the crisis limited their impact. Despite hardships, life persisted. In Madrid, couples married in air raid shelters. In Barcelona, musicians staged clandestine concerts. In rural areas, peasants continued farming despite bomb threats. Creativity and resilience appeared in small acts. Children played in sandbagged courtyards, blankets were sewn from scraps, and meals improvised from minimal ingredients. War imposed suffering but also strengthened community bonds. In nationalist zones, repression and ideological control intensified. The church regained central influence. Processions, mass gatherings, and public confessions shaped urban life. In Republican zones, political diversity generated internal tensions that erupted violently, particularly in Catalonia, where communists, socialists, and anarchists increasingly clashed. As military pressures mounted, Republican internal fractures became as decisive as nationalist offensives. The coalition that had held at the war's outbreak unraveled under ideological differences, military imperatives, and political disputes. In Catalonia and parts of Aragon, the social revolution led primarily by the CNTFAI had transformed economic and political life. Factories were collectivized, land worked collectively, anarchist patrols maintained order, and revolutionary sectors argued that defeating Franco without transforming society was impossible. They defended militia autonomy and collectivization as essential to sustain the war effort. In contrast, the Communist Party of Spain and its Catalan branch, the PSUC, prioritized victory above all, postponing social revolution. Aligned with Soviet discipline, communists pushed for a unified, hierarchical army, arguing that revolutionary actions weakened military capacity and fostered disorder. Socialists were divided. Indalecio Prieto's faction sided with communists on centralization, while Largo Caballero's faction sympathized with coexistence alongside the social revolution, albeit cautiously. Republican authorities sought institutional balance, crumbling under war pressures. In Catalonia, the Generalitat under Luis Companys attempted to coexist with anarchists who controlled much of the economy and public security. State authority became largely symbolic, and tensions escalated as Catalan communists gained influence with Soviet support. By late 1936 and early 1937, Catalonia's revolutionary character was increasingly questioned by the central government. Under Juan Negrin, communist influence strengthened, aiming to re-establish state control, manage the economy, and place militias under central command, particularly within security and intelligence services. Resistance came from anarchists, who saw this reorganization as a threat to the revolution. The most serious confrontations centered on the Barcelona telephone exchange, controlled by CNT militants since July 1936. Its control was vital. It managed internal communications for the Generalitat and monitored Valencia calls. For anarchists, control symbolized revolutionary sovereignty. For government and communists, it threatened military coordination. On May 3, 1937, Generalitat officials, supported by Mossos d'Esquadra and PSUC forces, attempted to seize the exchange. The operation escalated immediately into a shootout. Anarchists barricaded themselves, and news spread rapidly. Barcelona was soon divided by barricades, with anarchists, POUM militants, and autonomous groups occupying streets, squares, and buildings, while PSUC, Mossos, and government forces defended key areas. For 5 days, the city experienced a war within the war, communications cut, factories halted, and militias abandoned fronts. PSUC offices were attacked, anarchist radio stations called for resistance against Stalinist authoritarianism, and POUM leaders denounced Soviet attempts to impose control. Ideological tension turned into armed conflict. The central government sent ministers, carabineros, and assault guards to restore order. Companies mediated to prevent total collapse. By May 8, a fragile agreement was reached, anarchists dismantled some barricades, and public order forces partially regained control, though the damage was irreversible. Political consequences were immediate. Largo Caballero resigned on May 17, marking the communist line's triumph in the Republican government. Negrin assumed leadership, promoting centralization, military discipline, and alignment with the USSR. For anarchists, this was devastating. For POUM, it marked the beginning of the end. By June, POUM was banned, Andres Nin arrested and later killed. Silent repression, largely orchestrated by Soviet-linked intelligence, eliminated revolutionary opposition. Anarchist militias that had fought since the war's outset felt betrayed. Militias were integrated into the People's Army, losing autonomy. Collectivization receded in Catalonia, and the Aragon Front, weakened by chaotic demobilization, became vulnerable to nationalist offensives. The Republican side entered a phase of strict military discipline but also deep political and emotional fractures. Franco exploited these weaknesses, consolidating his forces. The iron unity of the nationalists increasingly contrasted with the fractured mosaic of the Republic. Franco's final offensive began after the Republican defeat at the Ebro at the end of 1938. The People's Army was exhausted, decimated, and poorly supplied. Catalonia, one of the last Republican strongholds, was isolated. Franco concentrated forces to crush Catalan resistance. The offensive began in December 1938 in the Segre and Ebro basins. Nationalist columns, reinforced by artillery, motorized units, and German and Italian aviation, advanced systematically, breaking Republican lines. Exhausted Republican forces offered limited resistance. By early January 1939, positions collapsed, forcing disorganized retreats. The fall of Litas signaled Catalonia's imminent fall. Nationalist aviation bombed roads, railways, and bridges, leaving cities without electricity, communications, or coordinated defense. The Condor Legion targeted refugee columns, military vehicles, and civilians. Republican forces, lacking fuel and ammunition, disintegrated. Hundreds of thousands fled toward France, creating chaos under winter rain and bombardment. On January 15, nationalist forces entered Tarragona. January 22, Negrin and Republican leaders fled Barcelona. On January 26, 1939, nationalists entered Barcelona with minimal resistance. Francoist control was imposed, Republican flags removed, Francoist insignia raised, and new political and military order established. The offensive continued toward Girona and Figueres, where the last Republican Cortes convened clandestinely. By February 5, 1939, the final fighters crossed the Pyrenees. France, overwhelmed, interned refugees in camps such as Argils, Saint-Cyprien, and Gers, where thousands endured extreme cold, hunger, and disease. The fall of Catalonia left the Republic militarily and diplomatically isolated. Western democracies recognized Franco in late February 1939. Soviet support waned, and Mexico lacked capacity to influence events. Republican territories, Levant, Central Spain, and Madrid faced terminal decline. Morale collapsed, supplies were scarce, and the People's Army lost operational capacity. Political disorder escalated in Valencia. The National Defense Council in Madrid, led by Colonel Casado, criticized Negrin for prolonging a lost war. Casado, supported by moderate socialists, anarchists, and part of the army, launched the Casado coup on March 5, 1939, to depose Negrin and negotiate peace. Fighting between pro-communist and Casado-aligned forces worsened Republican disorganization. Negrin, sheltered at Monavar Air Base, acknowledged the Republic's internal collapse.
Franco demanded total surrender, advancing through Levante and central Spain unopposed.
Alicante, one of the last Republican ports, became overcrowded with refugees, many sent to Francoist concentration camps.
The final offensive on Madrid left the city defenseless. Franco's troops seized strategic positions with minimal resistance, confronting a population exhausted by 3 years of war. On March 28, Madrid fell. Mass arrests, purges, confiscations, and strict controls began immediately. Within days, all remaining Republican territory was under Franco. On April 1, 1939, Franco broadcast the final war report. The Red Army has been captured and disarmed.
National troops have achieved their final military objectives. With this declaration, the Spanish Civil War officially ended, a conflict of nearly 3 years, leaving a devastated territory, traumatized population, and massive refugee crisis that would shape Spain for decades.